Second, Life of a Monarch. A series in 8 parts narrated by the former royal correspondent Jenny Bond, who for many years observed the life and work of the Queen and her family.
London in the early 1920s was full of music, joyful jazz and high-energy beats for each new dance craze, the Charleston, the Foxtrot, the Lindy Hop. Music which reflected Londoners' determination to throw off the shackles of wartime privations and transform the city into a modern metropolis. For those stuck at home, the music arrived via the new wireless radio, the technical marvel of the era. Those who could get out enjoyed this music live in the gleaming clubs, cocktail bars and dance halls that sprang up around the capital as women relished their freedom not just to vote, but to smoke, to drink, to drive, to wear short hair and shorter skirts, which made the wild new dances so much easier to execute. But this breath of fresh air was to be painfully short-lived. By the mid-1920s, boom had turned to bust. High interest rates and low investment quickly led to depression, deflation and decline. Worst of all, British coal reserves, depleted during the war, meant the country was now importing more coal than it was mining. By the dull, wet spring of 1926, a long, bitter coal dispute was moving rapidly towards a dramatic climax, one with drastic implications for the nation. The mine owners were determined to slash wages and lengthen hours to maintain their profits. The already impoverished miners were determined to resist. It broke down on April the 14th. The miners, backed by other unions, asked the Conservative Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin to intervene. These talks failed too. Within days, millions of working men across the country were preparing to down tools in support of the miners, leaving the country faced with the terrifying prospect of a complete shutdown for the first time in British history. At the eye of the storm was Home Secretary Sir William Joynson Hicks, who, with Baldwin and the Chancellor, Winston Churchill, was working round the clock to avert the crisis. So when a call came just after midnight on April the 21st to attend a minor royal birth because of age-old protocol, his reaction was not one of amusement. But Sir William dutifully hurried to 17 Bruton Street. Now a fashionable hair transplant clinic, in 1926 the Grand Mayfair House was the London Moor, Scottish nobles who could trace their lineage back to the 14th century. Lady Elizabeth had married the King's shy, stammering second son, Bertie, 3 years earlier, and now her first child was imminent. The little girl, also named Elizabeth, arrived at 2:40 a.m. after a caesarean section, and Sir William was able to confirm her legitimacy and then rush back to Downing Street. Among the first visitors were Bertie's parents, King George V and Queen Mary.
"Such a relief and joy,"
wrote the Queen in her diary,
"a little darling with lovely complexion and pretty fair hair."
Bertie later wrote anxiously to his mother,
"I do hope that you and Papa are as delighted as we are to have a granddaughter, or would you sooner have another grandson? I know Elizabeth wanted a daughter."
A daughter was fine, he was reassured. After all, she was hardly likely to inherit. Public reaction to the birth was relatively muted, not least because the baby's rich Scottish grandparents were major mine owners. But a crowd of loyal royalists soon gathered in Bruton Street in the hope of seeing the princess and to greet the messengers arriving with telegrams and presents. But within a fortnight, the papers had more serious matters in mind. At 1 minute to midnight, on May the 3rd, the general strike began. Nearly 2 million workers downed tools. The transport network was crippled, printing presses ground to a halt, and vital food deliveries were held up. The government responded by bringing in an army of specially recruited policemen to keep food supplies moving and volunteers to drive the buses. In the absence of the usual newspapers, the government published its own, called the British Gazette, edited by the exuberant Chancellor Churchill.
Strike is a process of reducing people by cruel losses on all sides. Government, miners, mine owners are all reduced to the same position where, after the lapse of time, they come into a more reasonable frame of mind, and offer in weakness or in sorrow to make a settlement. But that is an entirely different thing from the concerted, deliberate, organised menace of a general strike in order to compel Parliament to do something which it otherwise would not do. A general strike in a great number of trades obviously means, if it were continued for any length of time, the ruin of the country.
However, sympathy for the miners came from an unexpected source, the King. While not allowed to intervene publicly, behind the scenes George V urged the government not to ban unions from distributing much-needed money for food. And while at Newmarket races, on hearing one wealthy landowner calling
revolutionaries,
the king rounded on him angrily.
Try living on their wages before you judge them.
Then, 9 days after it began, the strike ended. The unions capitulated without a single concession. The miners trickled back to work with lower pay and longer hours than ever. Terrible industrial relations would continue through the decade as Britain moved towards the Great Depression of the 1930s. Miners would be particularly hard hit, with unemployment reaching 70% near some pits. Millions of mining families would be left destitute. Oblivious to all political tumult outside the walls of her grandparents' house, the infant Elizabeth snoozed in her elegant nursery. A few months later, she moved with her parents to their own London residence, 5 Piccadilly, 2 doors down from Apsley House, the Duke of Wellington's palatial home. By the time of Elizabeth's birth, the traffic noise along the mile length of Piccadilly had meant that most aristocratic residents of the great mansions that flanked the ancient highway had moved away, leaving the grand hotels like the Ritz, the gentlemen's clubs, and the upmarket stores dating back to the 1700s, such as Fortnum & Mason's and Hatchard's bookshop. Life for an upper-class infant followed a well-established regime, and things were no different for royalty. In each royal establishment there would be a suite of rooms at the top of the house, known collectively as the nursery. Here, Nanny would take over the care of the baby from the time the maternity nurse left, around a month after the birth. Elizabeth's nanny, Clara Knight, known as Alla, was assisted by both an undernurse and a nursemaid. Nannies were usually handed on down the family, much like the furniture and coat of arms. This was certainly the case for Elizabeth. Clara had been her mother's nanny before her, and quietly continued the age-old Edwardian routines, both at 145 Piccadilly and at the York's exquisite country retreat, the Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park. By the age of 2, Elizabeth was already impressing those around her. Winston Churchill, after an encounter at Balmoral, wrote of his impressions to his wife.
Princess Elizabeth is a character. She has an air of authority and reflectiveness astonishing in an infant.
She was also the favourite grandchild of George V. It was the king who gave Elizabeth her lifelong nickname, Lilibet, as the toddler struggled with Elizabeth. In turn, Lilibet called the king Grandpa England. In 1929, on the advice of his doctors, Bognor Regis to help him recuperate from a near-fatal illness. Her first trip to the seaside, she would play in the sand while he watched her. For her 4th birthday, the doting old man bought her a pony called Peggy. Her first equine pet, Peggy's arrival was at least as exciting as that of her new sister, Margaret, a few months later. When Elizabeth was 5, a governess was employed. Unlike the dour academics traditionally chosen to hammer some history into unwilling royal minds, Marion Crawford was an unconventional choice. A shy Scottish girl of 22, of modest background and education, but in fact her youth was a major attraction. Bertie remembered his dreary boyhood tutors with horror, and really just wanted someone with enough energy to run around and play with Lilibet and later Margaret. Any thought of school was quite out of the question. Girls, so a light education was considered the most appropriate. The thought of producing an educated intellectual or blue-stocking was not just alarming, but potentially dangerous. Hide-and-seek, hopscotch, sardines, music, dancing, and rolling around with the family dogs were just as important as the odd half-hour of history or arithmetic. Later, far more time would be spent on riding than book-based lessons. The girls were as rumbustious as any other kids. Physical brawls were not unknown, and while Margaret was a biter, Lilibet had a quick temper and a decent right hook. Religion certainly didn't trouble the household overmuch. Church was attended, but Queen Mary was said to deplore the fact that Bertie let the tradition of family prayers lapse. The girls both adored Crawford, to them for the next 14 years, constantly postponing her own wedding and personal life until Elizabeth herself was married. While Nanny looked after the princess's health, baths and clothes, Crawford had them from 9 to 6. Each day was bookended by noisy, fun sessions with their parents, and then lessons, liberally interspersed with silly games and exercise. In the grounds of Royal Lodge, the girls had their own retreat, a scaled-down thatched cottage given to Lilibet on her 6th birthday by the people of Wales. Bothenbach, or the little house, was their favourite toy for years. Although built to a scale of 2/3, the cottage was fully equipped with electric lights, hot water, a radio, a full set of monogrammed linen, and kitchen equipment. The girls did the cleaning and housework themselves, including covering the furniture in dust sheets whenever they returned. Perhaps partly because of her isolation from other children, Lilibet was obsessed with horses and dogs. She used her shilling-a-week pocket money to amass a large collection of farm animals from Woolworths, and told Crawfie that when she grew up, she would marry a farmer and have lots of cows, horses, and children. She scoured the Christmas catalogues each year, marking up all the horsey things, and in London gathered a collection of more than 30 toy horses, mostly on wheels. A tidy child, she would carefully polish each one's saddle and bridle. One of her favourite games was to harness up Crawfie with some red reins and trot around the nursery, delivering imaginary groceries. On occasion, even George V could be persuaded to get down on all fours and play horsey, with Lilibet leading him around by the beard. Sometimes Lilibet would be the horse. At Windsor, of course, she could ride the real thing, but life in London was much more restricted. When the children played in the communal gardens behind the house, the press and public would push against the railings to watch the small princesses, much as they would animals in a zoo. Outings beyond Piccadilly were rare. The odd low-key, incognito excursion into Hyde Park, perhaps. There the girls would watch other children shyly, keen to make friends, but kept by the staff at a safe distance. Once, Crawfie took the children on the tube to the YWCA in Tottenham Court Road. The experience of buying a ticket, descending the escalator, and sitting on the underground train was wilder than anything the girls had experienced. In the YWCA canteen, they marvelled at the cheap teacups and thick bread and butter, and they had to carry their own tray. Unfortunately, the exotic trip came to an abrupt end when the party was recognised, and Crawfie had to call for the Duke's chauffeur to whisk them away. The days of Princess Diana openly taking her 2 small boys to homeless hostels and hospitals was still half a century away. When the IRA upped their London bombing activities in the 1930s, the girls' modest outings were stopped altogether. Their lonely, if luxurious world contracted back to the nursery, Nanny, and Crawfie. After finally leaving the royal household, Crawfie wrote a book, The Little Princesses, a saccharine account of their lives together. Compared to subsequent royal exposé, it was the mildest, almost sycophantically complimentary of texts. So she could hardly have expected the wave of royal wrath that would engulf her so completely. Damning her that Crawfie had clearly gone off her head. She was instantly and permanently ostracised from the entire family. It was a painful, cruel exile that lasted for the rest of her life and may have contributed to a late-life suicide attempt. When Elizabeth was 10, Grandpa England went to bed in Sandringham a few weeks after the Christmas holidays, complaining of a cold. Worn out by the toll of reigning through the Great War and by a lifetime of heavy smoking, a regular royal vice, the 70-year-old never left his bed again. On January the 20th, Lord Dawson, the royal physician, released a statement to the press confirming that
the King's life is moving peacefully towards its close.
He died at a few minutes before midnight. Nearly 50 years later was that Dawson injected the king with fatal doses of morphine and cocaine. This was to ensure that he had a painless death in time for an announcement to be carried in the morning papers rather than the less appropriate evening journals. After the injections, Dawson phoned his wife in London, telling her to advise the Times to hold back publication for a short while. It did. And as a result, the nation awoke to the restrained headline, "A Peaceful Ending at Midnight." Elizabeth was at Royal Lodge with Margaret when Grandpa England died. Crawfie was recalled from holiday to look after the girls, while their parents helped with the formal arrangements. While Margaret was too young to take it all in, state and the state funeral. At first, life after the funeral continued much as before, just with fewer visits from Uncle David, now King Edward VIII. He'd been a favourite visitor on account of his great affection for his nieces and childish willingness to play really silly games. After his accession, though, according to Crawfey, he kept making plans with the children and then forgetting them. He was, after all, busy being king. Then one weekend, Uncle David brought some friends to visit the family at Royal Lodge, including a stylish American woman called Wallis Simpson. It was Elizabeth's first exposure to the twice-married woman whose ambition would change the course of her life. Antipathy to
that woman
is well documented. There's no record of Lilibet's first impressions of her. Mrs. Simpson's name began to appear regularly in the court circular among the guests at Fort Belvedere, the King's country house in Windsor, just a short drive from Royal Lodge. Soon, gossip and speculation were rampant. In August, shocking photographs appeared of the whippet-thin femme fatale with her trademark helmet of black hair and slash of scarlet lipstick, cavorting with the irresponsible new king on an ill-judged yachting trip around the Mediterranean. David was clearly infatuated with this mistress beyond reasoning, even though being with her sapped his confidence as she regularly berated him in public. Yet, however outrageously she behaved, the king, in the words of his equerry,
followed her round like a dog.
Then line finally revealed the gravity of the situation.
The king and ministers. Great constitutional crisis.
Nobody at 145 Piccadilly could ignore the obvious any longer. The Yorks tried to keep the children distracted with swimming lessons away from the house, but Elizabeth, at 10, was fully aware of the strained atmosphere at home as she watched the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, and various archbishops and other pillars of the establishment arrive at her father's study. At the end of each meeting, he would emerge looking pale, haggard, and anxious. Bertie was panic-stricken at the thought of having to give up his happy private life in the event of an abdication. Cripplingly shy in public, he loathed being in any sort of spotlight, and the prospect of taking over the throne terrified him. But his sense of duty made it equally impossible for him to try to dodge it. His private secretary initially feared that Bertie might have a nervous breakdown, but the Duke wrote to him bravely,
"If the worst happens and I have to take over, you can be assured that I will do my best to clear up the inevitable mess. If the whole fabric does not crumble under the shock and strain of it all."
Finally, after 11 agonising months of negotiation with the government, King Edward VIII abdicated in order to marry Wallis Simpson. 2 days before the abdication, Bertie had sobbed like a child in his mother's arms at the sheer horror of what he was having to take on. David's abdication speech was broadcast to a horrified nation on December 11th, 1936.
At long last I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything, but until now it has not been constitutionally possible. A few hours ago, I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor, and now that I have been succeeded by my brother, the Duke of York, my first words must be to declare my allegiance to him. This I do with all my heart. You all know the reasons which have impelled me to renounce the throne. But I want you to understand that in making up my mind, I did not forget the country or the empire, which, as Prince of Wales and lately as King, I have for 25 years tried to serve. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as King as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman.
The Duchess of York was in bed with flu during the broadcast, but knowing how frightened her husband was of the life that was about to envelop him, she wrote angrily to her brother-in-law,
"We are all overcome with misery."
Queen Mary was equally distraught. Her husband's prophecy that their stunningly self-absorbed eldest son would ruin himself within 12 months of his death was coming true. He was putting himself first yet again, oblivious of the cost to his brother, the crown, or the nation. 2 years after the abdication, she wrote to him,
"I do not think you have ever realized the shock which the attitude you took up caused your family and the whole nation. It seemed inconceivable to those who had made such sacrifices during the war that you, as their king, refused a lesser sacrifice."
The country, which would so soon be at war, from a weak and self-pitying leader, a Nazi sympathiser who plotted with Hitler and who endangered Allied interests so severely that he would soon be exiled to the Bahamas, one of the furthest points of the empire. It was left to Crawfey to break the news to Lilibet and Margaret that they were going to live in Buckingham Palace.
What? You mean forever?
Lilibet asked. The proclamation took place the morning after the broadcast. With the new Queen still ill in bed, Bertie left 145 Piccadilly, dressed as an admiral of the fleet. It was explained to the girls that when he came home at lunchtime, he would be the King of England, and they would have to curtsy to him. Bertie sensibly chose George as his name as king, hoping that the country would accept the transition from their beloved George V to George VI, with the brief, a regrettable blip that would recede over time. He even took over the coronation date that had been chosen for Edward VIII, again keeping any changes and fuss to a minimum. The new king and queen moved straight into Buckingham Palace, the little girls following a few weeks later in the removal van that held the precious toy horses. In 1936, the palace was cold and gloomy, teeming with mice, full of interminable corridors and furniture and fixings so ancient that they often fell to bits in your hands. It was also more of a village than a home, with its own postal system and endless officials rushing around. With the exuberance of youth, the girls found the change exciting and would rush around the corridors, chased by Dookie, the Queen's favourite corgi. Then, after months of painstaking preparation and rehearsal, came the coronation. The family got little sleep the night before, a combination of excitement and the noise of the crowds that had been gathering for 2 days. Elizabeth, writing an account of the day shortly afterwards, recorded being woken at 5 before wrapping herself in an eiderdown and peeping outside onto a cold, misty morning. For the shy, stuttering, publicity-hating Albert, it was an ordeal from the start. For his young daughters, it was dazzling, not least their splendid clothes, long lace gowns trimmed with gold bows and purple velvet cloaks edged with ermine. Elizabeth's cloak had a little train, and both girls had specially light coronets. They enjoyed the long procession to the Abbey in Queen Mary's glass coach, where the procession was captured on film for the BBC's very first outside broadcast. Inside the Abbey, away from the cameras, the girls joined Queen Mary in the royal box, which afforded the best view of the 3-hour service.
I thought it all very, very wonderful, and I expect the Abbey did too,
Elizabeth wrote.
The arches and beams at the top were covered with a sort of haze of wonder as Papa was crowned. Some of the complex rites and ancient rituals did, she admitted, get quite boring. During the prayers, she and Queen Mary skipped to the end of the programme and, seeing that only a few pages were left, smiled at each other in conspiratorial relief. A then of photographs and balcony appearances. And finally, it was time for Papa's address to the Empire.
It is with a very full heart that I speak to you tonight. Never before has a newly crowned king been able to speak to all his peoples in their own homes on the day of his coronation. I cannot find words with which to thank you for your love and loyalty to the Queen and myself, for your goodwill in the streets today, and your countless messages from overseas and from every quarter of these islands have filled our hearts to overflowing.
Listening to it now, it's still a moving speech of great dignity and humility, paternal and compassionate, promising dutiful service. It must have gone a long way to restoring the frayed faith of the nation after that. It's also touching to hear the shy king struggle courageously and largely successfully to control his dreaded stammer. His Australian speech therapist, Lionel Logue, was on hand throughout to offer support. 11-year-old Lilibet, listening in an adjacent room, knew that she would be the next to make such a declaration.
Dutiful service.
That the idyllic life of a farmer's wife she'd once described to Crawfie would never be hers, and that her entire life would now be preordained, purposeful, and above all, public. The late 1930s brought turmoil in Europe. By 1937, the Spanish Civil War had entered a second brutal, blood-soaked year. As Franco's forces gradually gained the upper hand, a fascist alliance strengthened across the continent. In Germany, after 4.5 years in power, Adolf Hitler held a secret conference in the Reich Chancellery. In it, he revealed his plans for forced German expansion across Europe. Across the Atlantic, further from the gathering storm, optimism was rising as Americans began to feel the benefits of Roosevelt's New Deal, and the country began to recover from the biggest, hungriest economic depression in its history. In Britain, the pageantry of the coronation had dominated the national imagination for the first half of the year.
The hodgepodge of religion, nostalgia, mumbo-jumbo, and military display.
It had not just been about the consecration of a new king. Its wider function had been to put Britain's best face to the world. Elizabeth and Margaret continued to adapt to a new life in Buckingham Palace. Their living quarters were slowly modernised, so it felt less like camping in a museum, as Crawford had described their arrival before the coronation. Subtler changes were also at play. Now Lilibet was accompanied by a detective everywhere she went, with another policeman outside the room. She now referred to Mummy and Papa as the King and Queen, and she saw far less of them as they busied themselves with royal functions. In the nursery, meals were served by 2 scarlet-liveried footmen and accompanied by menus written in French. It was felt at court that it was time to think again about Elizabeth's education. A university was still considered out of the question, and so an apprenticeship was effectively designed for her. She would learn the job by doing it. The coronation itself was thought to be an ideal starting point. Before the ceremony, Crawford was instructed to read to Lilibet Queen Victoria's account of her own coronation, written exactly a century earlier. Afterwards, she was included in a number of official coronation events, where she learned to acknowledge the crowds politely and to greet and engage with the various dignitaries. As there were even fewer opportunities to meet other children at Buckingham Palace than there had been at Piccadilly, part of the drive to make Lilibet less socially isolated was to create a carefully selected company of girl guides. Soon Princess Elizabeth was deputy leader of the Kingfisher Patrol of the first Buckingham Palace company of brownies was established soon after for Margaret. Being in the guides gave Lilibet the opportunity to interact with a group of other rich girls in learning how to birdwatch, cook sausages over a campfire, and dance Highland reels. The long corridors of Buckingham Palace proved particularly useful for signalling practice. While not a scholar, Elizabeth was aware of the political situation around the world, helped by her new classes in constitutional and European history. Her tutor, Sir Henry Martin, from nearby Eton College, stressed to her, among many other lessons, that the secret of the British monarchy's survival was its ability to adapt. A lesson that clearly went deep, and that she has had to draw on many times in the 75 years since. As Lilibet entered her teenage years, the childish clothes were slowly set aside. Hat stockings replaced white socks, and hems were lowered. She started to attend the palace garden parties and to take a role in small public events, handing out gymkhana rosettes or swimming shields. In May 1939, the King and Queen embarked on a 6-week tour of Canada and America. The political goal was clear and urgent: to shore up support for Britain in anticipation of war with Germany. Speed was essential. By the time the royal couple embarked ship at Portsmouth, Hitler had already marched into Prague, Franco had taken Madrid, and a full-scale European war was just months away. The tour was a massive PR success. The King struck up a genuine friendship with Roosevelt, and the personal popularity of the royal couple went a long way in persuading the States to come to the Allies' aid in the darkest days of the war. Back at home, Lilibet and Margaret kept in touch with their parents with letters, photos, and the first Royal International phone call. They finished the historic conversation by holding a corgi up to the receiver and pinching it to make her bark.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
When war was declared on September the 3rd, the children were at Birk Hall, a royal residence 7 miles from Balmoral. It was the first of a number of secret locations where it was felt they could be kept safer than in London. The suggestion that they should be evacuated like other rich children to Canada was famously scuppered by their mother. "The children won't go without me, I won't leave without the king, and the king will never leave." The following May, as the conflict intensified, they were moved to Windsor Castle.
"We went there for the weekend and stayed for 5 years,"
Margaret would later tell friends. Initially, they slept in the dungeons for safety. Simple meals were taken in the state dining room, where the chandelier had been replaced by a single light bulb. Lessons continued much as before Palace. They were contented years for Lilibet. She had Crawfie and Margaret and her dogs. She continued her riding lessons and even joined the Sea Rangers. Each year she and Margaret would stage an elaborate pantomime, which involved a huge amount of excited preparation. As the war progressed, the royal children became a useful propaganda asset for the government. They were pictured nobly enduring the same privations as everyone else. They received the same measly food rations. Even their birthday cakes, the palace let it be known, were scaled down to plain sponges. And the Queen ensured her hand-me-downs were refashioned, first for Lilibet, then Margaret. The other carefully projected image was of the girls in a tableau of idealised family life. Relaxing by the fire, surrounded by pets, the royals represented the British and was fighting to preserve. On the 13th of October 1940, Elizabeth made her first radio broadcast during the BBC's Children's Hour. Officially intended for children who had been evacuated to North America and Canada, its real propaganda objective was to influence American adults and government.
"All of us children who are still at home think continually of our friends and relations who have gone overseas, who have travelled thousands of miles to find a wartime home and a kindly welcome in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the United States of America."
It was an excellent introduction to live broadcasting, and Elizabeth had clearly watched her father and grandfather before her. Her high-pitched cut-glass voice was clear and sweet, even if she did sound far. At the end, she even introduced a little ad-lib of her own.
"My sister is by my side, and we are both going to say good night to you. Come on, Margaret. Good night and good luck to you all."
Slowly, Lilibet assumed more royal responsibilities. She made her first solo appearance at 16. In a lace-collared dress and sensible shoes, she inspected the Grenadier Guards, of which she'd recently been appointed honorary colonel. The press pictures show a tiny figure, ridiculously young, among the towering soldiers. April 1944 brought her 18th birthday. For Elizabeth, the coming of age signified so much more than that of any other upper-crust girl. It meant that she was entitled to succeed to the throne without the need of a regent. To mark her official transition to a nursery bedroom, and installed in a pink and cream suite of her own. She also acquired her own staff, including a lady-in-waiting. The king also gave her her first corgi, Susan. Lilibet was devoted to her, despite Susan's tendency to bite the staff. She subsequently bred more than 10 generations of Susan's descendants, and still has 2 to this day. Susan was also the mother of a long line of Dorgies, a new breed of dog Elizabeth produced by mating a corgi with a dachshund of Margaret's called Pipkin. In February 1945, Lilibet, after some cajoling of her reluctant papa, joined the Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service, effectively the women's wartime branch of the army. She was registered as number 230873, Honorary Second Subaltern Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor. And in car maintenance. She loved the experience. So did the rest of the world, which soaked up the morale-boosting images of her looking pretty in her army overalls, spanner in hand, peering under a bonnet, or smiling behind the wheel.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m. at General Eisenhower's headquarters, General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and Grand Admiral Donitz, the designated head of the German state, signed the Act of Unconditional Surrender of all German land, sea, and air forces in Europe to the Allied Expeditionary Force, and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command. Our dear Channel Islands will be free tomorrow. Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May.
The end of the war continued the wave of popularity that the king had been riding for the past 5 years. For the monarchy to come out of the bloodshed not just unscathed, but with its reputation enhanced, was extraordinary. And unique. No other European royal house could claim the same. They'd pulled off the astonishing trick of seeming to be grander than the people, servants of the people, and of the people, all at the same time. And the nation was grateful. Very grateful. On VE Day, it wasn't Winston Churchill, the real victor of the fight, that the riotously patriotic crowds most wanted to see. The happy mob roared for the king. Within minutes of each balcony appearance, the communal cry would start again. "We want the king! We want the king!" Closely followed by... That evening, Lilibet and Margaret were allowed to slip out of the palace with a small group of friends and bodyguards and mingle anonymously with the crowds. It was a unique moment of personal freedom for them. After 5 years at Windsor Castle and a lifetime of scrutiny, for one glorious evening, they were liberated. Linking arms to join the revelry, Lilibet in her uniform managed to merge in with the thousands of other servicemen and women, although she kept her cap pulled down over her face, terrified of being recognised. After the war, it took time to adjust to the peace. For Lilibet, it meant more solo functions. Government-approved, non-controversial functions, opening libraries, presenting prizes, inspecting troops. Most were deadly dull, but she never rebelled. Inevitably, as she reached towards her marital prospects, and more specifically, the problem of where to find the right groom. Every heir to the throne has had to consider dynastic issues, as well as personal inclination when it comes to marriage. Lilibet was no exception. After all, it was only a decade since Uncle David had lost the throne over his crazy choice of consort. And yet this was the 20th century. Nobody wanted to force a husband onto the princess. Lilibet's own social circle was tiny, and it didn't include many suitable men. The other problem, ironically, was that she was such a huge catch. Beautiful, charming, hugely wealthy, and heiress to the world's premier monarchy. It would take a supremely confident, not to say arrogant, young man to embark on such a courtship. Yet such a man did exist, and Elizabeth was happy to fall in love with him. In fact, Lilibet had known Prince Philip of Greece for much of her life. Both were great-great-grandchildren of Queen Victoria, and related several times over, so their paths had crossed a number of times at family events. But their first significant encounter had been just before the war, in July 1939. The King and Queen had taken 13-year-old Lilibet on a visit to the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth. Prince Philip, a personable new cadet at the college, was chosen to entertain the princesses while their parents met officials. It was a date involving croquet, tennis, and lemonade. Later, Philip joined the royal family on the yacht for afternoon tea. Both events had been engineered by the King's ambitious cousin, Louis Mountbatten. Mountbatten was Philip's uncle and protector, a shrewd and determined plotter who had early... And it worked like a charm. The impressionable and utterly inexperienced Lilibet was immediately smitten by the tall, blonde, athletic 18-year-old. 5 years older, Philip already had a reputation as a girl-crazy party animal.
Blondes, brunettes, and red-haired charmers,
wrote one of his regular aristocratic hosts.
Philip gallantly, and I think impartially, squired them all.
There were persistent rumours of a liaison with a cabaret singer, and plenty of accounts of his determination to play the field for as long as he could. It was Mountbatten who made sure that his nephew kept up the exchange of letters with Lilibet that followed the meeting at Dartmouth, and continued through the war. For her part, stuck at Windsor, with little to occupy her except thoughts of her dashing naval hero, Lilibet... Contact beyond these letters was rare. Philip, who served with great distinction, spent his brief shore leaves moving between various relatives. But eventually the most important invitation arrived. The King and Queen invited him to spend Christmas 1943 with the royal family at Windsor Castle. He was thrilled. Elizabeth was now 17, and it was the couple's first real opportunity to get to know each other properly. It was a roaring success. During the panto, Philip showed loud appreciation for his now curvaceous cousin's singing and tap dancing, and the flirtatious fun carried on through the holiday. On Boxing Day, the King's equerry, Alan Lascelles, reported that,
after dinner and some charades, They rolled back the carpet in the crimson drawing-room, turned on the gramophone, and frisked and capered till nearly 1 a.m.
The courtship car was regularly seen zipping into Buckingham Palace and other discreet residences where Lilibet was a guest. Within months, Philip had confided to the Greek king that he wanted to marry Elizabeth. Mountbatten was triumphant, but the establishment was not, and nor were Lilibet's parents. As a potential suitor, Philip did have some merits. He had looks, charm, and an immaculate war record. He was certainly royal, in some ways more so than Elizabeth. He had royal blood on both sides of his family, while Elizabeth had only one royal parent. But Philip's family situation had gone horribly wrong. Philip was the 5th child and only son of Prince Andrew, the brother of King Constantine of Greece. But when he was still a toddler, the family had to flee the country after Andrew was sentenced to death for military misdemeanours. So George V had to send a warship to rescue them. Dispossessed and destitute, the refugees borrowed a small, cramped house near Paris. As his family disintegrated, Philip was sent to schools in England and Germany. During the holidays, he drifted between relatives' houses. Finally, his mother's brother, Louis Mountbatten, stepped up as a mentor. It wasn't just Philip's rackety background that worried courtiers. They considered him badly educated, boorish, and already a womanizer. They declared that he was unlikely to be faithful. And worse, that he had
the whiff of the fortune hunter
about him. There were also Philip's embarrassing Nazi connections. All of Philip's 4 sisters had married Nazis. One of them, Sophia, had been photographed with Hitler at Goering's wedding. She married an SS colonel, and her after the Führer. As for Philip personally, some of his mannerisms were already raising eyebrows. Even as a young man, it was noticed that on occasion he could be rude, arrogant, and temperamental. And gaffe-prone. Hoping a break might cool things down, in February 1947 the King and Queen took Lilibet on a 4-month tour of southern Africa, from Zimbabwe to Lesotho. An important diplomatic mission, it was designed to shore up the empire and strengthen the Commonwealth after the ravages of the war. It was certainly a glorious distraction for Elizabeth. As a first experience of going abroad, the contrast between ice-bound, austerity-deprived Britain and the sun-drenched red earth of Africa was dazzling. On April the 21st, Lilibet celebrated her 21st birthday in Cape Town. It was declared that afternoon she made a broadcast to the Empire and the Commonwealth, which would become the most famous of her life. In it, she pledged her life's work to the people of the Commonwealth.
On my 21st birthday, I welcome the opportunity to speak to all the peoples of the British Commonwealth and Empire, wherever they live, whatever race they come from, and whatever language they speak. Through the inventions of science, I can make my solemn act of dedication with the whole empire listening. I should like to make that dedication now. It is very simple. I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family, that I shall not have the strength to carry out this resolution alone, unless you join in it with me, as I now invite you to do. I know that your support will be unfailingly given. God help me to make good my vow, and God bless all of you who are willing to share in it.
Written by the ageing courtier Alan Lascelles, it was a vague, sentimental promise about a crumbling empire that would soon cease to exist. Yet, at that moment, as the world was still healing after the hardships of war and winter, it hit the right note. It gave reassurance that the monarchy would remain a reliable link in an unreliable universe, that it would remain safe in the hands of this morally wholesome, poised young woman. The broadcast was a massive success, and the crowning achievement of a triumphant tour. Home, despite the separation and the distractions, Lilibet made it clear that she had not changed her mind about Philip. She wanted to marry Philip, and no one but Philip would do. In the face of her determination, the opposition conceded defeat. Finally, on July the 10th, 1947, the long-expected engagement was announced from Buckingham Palace, with a wedding date set for November the 20th.
It is with the greatest pleasure that the King and Queen announce the betrothal of their dearly beloved daughter, the Princess Elizabeth, to Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, Royal Navy, son of the late Prince Andrew of Greece, and Princess Andrew, Princess Alice of Battenberg, to which union the King has gladly given his consent.
The penniless prince's newly appointed valet noted that his wardrobe was scantier than that of many a bank clerk, and often lacked a clean shirt. However, he did manage to cobble together an acceptable engagement, diamonds from his mother's old tiara. Within weeks, wedding fever reached frenzied proportions as details of the lavish preparations began to leak out. A huge public pageant would distract the country from the awful economic crisis that was derailing its reforms and putting millions out of work. It was, as Churchill expressed it,
a flash of colour on the hard road we have to travel.
Public interest naturally centred on the dress. The fashion-deprived female population snapped up the reports of ivory silk, encrusted with pearls and crystals, satin and tulle. The princess was applauded for saving up many of the 300 clothing coupons needed for the £1,200 Norman Hartnell gown. Another top population was the cake. Made by McVitie's, the £500 9-foot confection used ingredients given as a wedding gift by Australian Girl Guides. After such fevered anticipation, the day itself did not disappoint. As one observer wrote, it was like a movie premiere, an election, a World Series and a Guy Fawkes night all rolled into one. Despite the bitingly cold November weather, crowds camped outside Buckingham Palace the night before to ensure the best views. The state coach procession to Westminster Abbey and the service inside were broadcast by wireless to 42 countries. The congregation of 2,000 included the flotsam of impoverished royalty from around Europe. Threadbare survivors of wars and revolutions, in their eyes, Cousin Philip had hit the jackpot. There were some obvious absentees not invited. The Duke of Windsor was also excluded and spent the day sulking in New York. At the ration-conscious austerity breakfast, the tables were decorated with heather and myrtle grown from the wedding bouquet of Queen Victoria. Afterwards, the couple set off for Waterloo Station in an open landau. With hot water bottles hidden under the blankets, they were pelted with rose petals as they passed through the palace gates. They started their modest honeymoon at Uncle Dickie's Hampshire home, Romney, before travelling north to Birk Hall, the Scottish royal residence where Lilibet had spent part of the war. Back in London, they moved into a suite at Buckingham Palace, while their own residence, Clarence House, was renovated. Philip was given an easy desk job at the Admiralty, and Lilibet entertained herself by unpacking presents and rearranging the furniture. By February, the forthcoming birth was announced on June the 4th, and the future Prince Charles instantly became the most famous fetus in the world. However, the joyful news was overshadowed by the sharply deteriorating health of the king. A lifetime of stress and chain-smoking, a long-standing family vice that had killed his father and grandfather, had given him serious vascular disease. The flow of blood to his legs was so severely restricted that doctors feared it might lead to gangrene and amputation. It was decided that the gravity of the king's condition should be kept from Lilibet until after the birth. On November the 14th, in the week of her first wedding anniversary, she went into labour. Prince Charles was born in a second-floor bedroom of Buckingham Palace shortly after 9 p.m. Philip was recalled from a game of squash to admire the new arrival.
Splendid baby.
2 days after the birth of his grandson, the 52-year-old king cancelled a tour of Australia and took to his bed. However premature, however inconvenient, it was nearly time for Elizabeth to step up. In the meantime, Philip had received a major promotion. He was appointed second in command of HMS Chequers, an important destroyer in the Mediterranean fleet based in Malta. Perhaps realising that his daughter would soon have to take on all royal responsibilities, the king was keen for her to enjoy some time as a regular